The shortest distance across the English Channel is 21 miles. That's the distance if you draw a straight line at the point where the French coastland and the British Isles are nearest one another, from just northeast of Dover to Cap-Rennais, France. A straight line between these 2 points would be ideal for someone attempting to swim the breadth of the channel, but the current usually moves them many miles side to side as the tide ebbs and flows. And sometimes it's so strong, people might exert all their might just to remain stationary. And since it's not exactly a quick swim, it can take anywhere from 7 to 12 hours. Swimmers must stop frequently during the swim to nourish themselves, but if they stop to eat for more than several seconds, they'll find themselves ushered far off course by the strong current. Not to mention the trash heaps and jellyfish with which swimmers have reportedly collided along the way, or the tankers and boats swirling around them, avoiding them as they swim. Now, because of all this, the actual distance athletes travel across the English Channel is generally much further than the shortest possible 21 miles. Writing in 1979, biochemist and museum professional Betty Davidson wrote, "Growing up disabled in America was like trying to swim the English Channel. It was a struggle all the way. And that was wrong for our country and our time. In our school for handicapped students, we had no music, art, physical activities, crafts, or contact with other children. Our goals and hopes were set by our limited, enclosed world." End quote. Though Betty Davidson was born into a society not prepared to sufficiently care for her disabilities, she had superseded that limited, enclosed world as first revealed to her. I'm Nathaniel Bozarth, and this is Wide Ruled, Brain Roots podcast on the past and present of equality in education. Today, we talk about students with disabilities, and we continue our focus on rural America. But first, a reminder that you can support Wide Ruled by visiting patreon.com/Wide Ruled Podcast. There, you can pledge as little as $1 for every episode we churn out. Every bit helps. Today you'll hear from Pam Allrich and Elaine Cook. Both are educators who have focused most, if not all, of their career on special education. Both hail from Pocahontas, a small town of about 1,700 in north-central Iowa. The size of Pocahontas and the surrounding towns as it affects special education will come up later in today's episode. One more thing, we recorded in Elaine's sunroom, so you'll hear birds chirping from just outside the windows from time to time.
My name is Pam Allrich. I am a former educational administrator in the area education system in the state of Iowa.
And I'm Elaine Cook, and I'm currently a transition coordinator and academic strat for the AEA system in Pocahontas.
Academic strategist? Is that what strat is short for
yes.
there? Okay, perfect. So first, could you just describe, do you have stories or no specific instances where a child, because of where they lived, was really sort of bereft of the resources that could have helped them?
My first 10 years that I was here in this area, 1984 to about 1994, as well as my school-based speech-language pathology, I provided services in the adult world, oftentimes hospitals. But I ran across a lady who had an executor who was watching over her. She had mental disabilities and had never been to school. And so she was in her, I want to say she was 65 to 70 years old and had never been to school and had been just basically taught to do domestic chores at home. And so as a speech pathologist, this attorney asked me to go and see her. And I can just still recall what an injustice, because she understood so many things and her speech was difficult to understand. but there could have been other assistance for her. Now we have lots of assistive technologies and things, but there still could have been other ways for her to be in a sheltered workshop, out engaging with people. It just struck me that in this day and age, there was still someone who had never been to school and never had that access to even attempt to learn, because somebody decided that she was not able to learn. And that's not true. There's nobody who's not able to learn.
In the 1800s, many students with disabilities, then called retarded, incorrigible, feeble-minded, insane, or idiots, were sent to state institutions that may have been hundreds of miles away from their parents. Depending on the systems, the institution might be a reform school or a psychiatric hospital, and often the standard of living at these institutions was less than adequate. But if you didn't live remotely near one of these institutions, or you couldn't afford the cost of room and board, you might not go to school at all, as was the case with this woman Pam met. By the early 20th century, this practice of sending children away was becoming less common. Special education classes began to be established for students who were regarded unfit for the general education classroom. These students were, however, generally segregated from the, quote, normal students. Elaine has a vivid memory from the 4th or 5th grade of this sort of treatment.
I remember one day while we were in class, somebody came to the door of our classroom and called one of our students and said, well, get everything out of your desk and come with me. And she said, well, where are we going? And I honestly remember the teacher said, or whoever was at the door, and I don't remember, said, well, you're not smart enough to be in this class. You have to leave, and you'll be going to school in the trailer. And the girl started to cry, and she goes, well, I want to stay with my friends, because she'd been in our class. And they said, well, you don't get to stay here anymore. You have to come. And I can just remember she had to take her stuff out of her desk, sobbing, while the person waited at the door. And we really almost never saw her again. And I can just remember thinking it was horrifying thing, and I felt so bad for her because she was our friend, and suddenly it was like we couldn't be friends anymore. So that was a pretty defining moment.
But prior to that moment, did you think of her as different?
No.
For any reason prior to that moment?
No. Well, I mean, we're all different.
Kids don't.
Yeah. So she was one of our friends, and it was one of those moments that define you, or you really remember. They went to the trailers, and recess wasn't together, so we had no more interaction with her, and that was a loss. I just remember feeling very, very sad. Yeah. And 'cause she was my friend, and we played, and suddenly it was like I lost a friend, but I didn't know why.
Well, I think it developed in some kids, and now as adults or older adults, kind of a fear of those folks that are different, almost a prejudice about folks who struggle. I think of, and especially nowadays we have such a issue with mental health services in this state in particular. I don't know. I think it's a nationwide thing. And I think a lot of that is the stigmatization of how do you handle someone who has a disability, and especially a mental illness. And I just think we created some of that by separating people in the past. And I know that I believe that kids that are the same age as Elaine's children and my stepchildren, they don't have that same stigma for people who are different than them.
So what was lost for students with disabilities under a segregated system?
They lost out on showing what they could do because they weren't given the opportunity. The bar was set low. If there's one thing true for kids in school, for your own kids, people will rise to the expectations that you have. If you set high expectations, most of the time, people will do their best to reach them. If you set the bar low, people will normally reach those. So when we put kids in isolation and set the limits too low for them, obviously research and the data shows that in hindsight, it's easy to say we did more harm than we did good. So fortunately, that's why there's been public laws, we've done the inclusion, and why we've gotten to where we are today.
And that's pretty difficult to swallow when you really let it sink in. Millions of humans have grown up and been given low expectations. What would have happened? What could they have achieved if more would have been expected of them? If someone had demonstrated to them that they were in fact able, if someone believed in them. The power of expectation is strong, and it informs not only special education practices, but also education in urban and low-income areas. Kids with disabilities, kids of color, English language learners, kids with behavioral issues. It's in the best interest of all our kids that they have teachers who expect greatness from them. So what happened to change the way students with disabilities were treated? The efficacy of American litigiousness. Those schools were gradually offering more in-school options for students who didn't fit the traditional general education mold. Many students were still being sent home with a school stamp of no can do, saying the student would be too expensive to educate by merit of the additional time and staff it would take to meet the student's needs. This left parents to privately educate their student with disabilities or nothing at all, as we mentioned earlier. So, in 1971, 13 families in Pennsylvania sued the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania on the basis of discriminatory practices. Specifically, they sued because built into Pennsylvania law was a clause that made it legal for schools to deny education to their students who were at least 8 years old, but who had a mental age of 5 or less. Within 2 years of filing, the district court gave a consenting decision ruling the Pennsylvania law both inequitable and unlawful. In the following year, a similar lawsuit took place in Washington, D.C., and the snowball began to roll. Just 2 years later, by 1973, Congress had passed the Rehabilitation Act, Section 504 of the act dealing specifically with education. Section 504, quote, prohibits the denial of public education participation or enjoyment of the benefits offered by public school programs because of a child's disability, end quote. In broad terms, this was primarily an anti-discrimination law, but it had no attached federal funds. This led the state of Iowa to take action to ensure that it would be in compliance.
Back in the 40s, 50s, there were probably over 4,000 school districts statewide, and they were small, but as the laws changed and these services needed to be provided for everybody, then districts kind of merged county-wide, and then they've merged more to get those resources, and that's when the AEA's, I think, push came to help provide, to make sure all of those resources were provided for all students that needed it.
We had a system probably up until the late 70s where we had each county had folks that they would hire who would provide those supplemental assistances to school districts, for instance, speech language pathologists or physical therapists or school psychologists. Again, I think it was in the late 80s.
1974,
late 70s,
the year after the Rehabilitation Act.
The state legislature divided the state into, at that time, were 15 area education agencies. They were aligned with the community college system in the state, and they would then provide services to all of the districts within their particular agency footprint. Those services were primarily around special education services, especially after the public laws started to change in terms of including special education services into the general education setting, because it was mandated now. And so it was very inequitable at the county level. Small counties like here in Pocahontas County, Adair County in southern Iowa would have had a tough time trying to employ enough folks to be able and be able to pay enough folks to be able to
be financially able to provide those services that they needed for all of those, because just the little part-times that they would need. So
Right.
So Iowa, like you said, at that time had a lot more districts than now. Were the AEAs created specifically with the smaller, sort of decentralized districts in mind? Was it sort of specifically for rural Iowa that they were created?
I think their main reason, to make sure it got back to the equity, that Johnny living here could still have the same services that Susie had here.
In Cedar Rapids versus Little Pocahontas.
A little, yeah. And so from that reason, they wanted to make sure that a student with disabilities, it didn't matter where you lived, you still had the same options to, and you were eligible and entitled for the same services.
And this gets into the urban-rural divide and some of the unique challenges to educating kids in small towns that I've been trying to unpack. It all comes down to economies of scale. Because funding is given on a per-pupil basis, districts serving a small number of students have less margin to hire part-time paraeducators and specialized professionals. And at the time that AEAs were created in Iowa, there was no federal funding for special education. That wouldn't come until a few years later, when the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was signed into law by Gerald Ford. The act is abbreviated to EHA. The EHA would later become the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Act, in 1990, when a lawsuit prompted the U.S. Department of Education to be more specific with some of the languaging in the former EHA. The result, as we live with it today in the IDEA, is that every child with a disability is guaranteed access to a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. This latter half, least restrictive environment, is especially important as it means schools ought to keep students with disabilities in the general education classroom, except in the most extreme cases when the special education student would be overly disruptive to the rest of the class. And this really boils down to something I've heard many special education educators say, which is that every special ed student is a general education student, gen ed student first.
One of the students that I worked with, he was one of the true tip of the iceberg. He could not read. I mean, he was very bright, but he couldn't remember a sight word. In high school, the teacher would work with him and try, you've got to know these sight words. And he would get him, he would work with him during that class period, and he'd come back 2 periods later for another class, and he could not literally retain them. He was just one of those tip of the triangle kids, but this student had such excellent coping skills. His auditory was phenomenal. If he heard anything, he had learned to use that to his advantage, and so he would have tests read to him, or the teacher just said he knew he needed that, so he read it to everybody, and the teacher started to laugh. He goes, it didn't take me long to figure out that I had to stop doing that, because the student would go, would you repeat what C was? And he goes, he noticed that everybody in the class was now changing theirs because they knew that he thought the answer was C because he was bright. He goes, we had to come up with a new technique because everybody's grades were improving because of his auditory skills.
Wow.
So kids can adapt very easily if they're given the tools and the strategies to do that.
It sort of makes me think of Daredevil, like you know the Daredevil where he's blind, but because he's like all of his other senses compensate, and for that he's a superhero in that case. Mm-hmm. So this kid had like superhero auditory learning abilities.
He had that mastered. He used that, but I mean he could not read. He could not. I mean, like kindergarten words, sight words, he could not.
Wow.
And he was bright. The written word was like reading Chinese to him. At school, he started working for a gentleman that had a construction business, and he was definitely your outdoor type of guy. And so he started working for him, I think, his junior year. And he said, I'd love for you to work with me because this guy was a gem. I mean, he was a hard worker. He was a fast learner. And it's what the student wanted to do. And so I'm sure he's still partnering and working with him, unless if he has now moved on, because that was probably 5 years ago. But he's
fascinating.
But he was a happy kid. He fit in well with his peers. I mean, I doubt if the majority of his peers knew the level of his discrepancy in reading, because he could answer all the questions as long as he could hear what the question was.
Elaine and Pam went on to talk about the benefits that integrated learning has for all students. When general education students are learning alongside students with significant disabilities, it builds empathy and prepares them for the workplace, where we all have strengths and weaknesses to bring to the table. And in fact, as special education continues to progress, it's to be expected that more and more students with disabilities will in fact be gaining the skills they need to stand out in society and the workplace, not for their disabilities, but for their abilities. One more thing Elaine and Pam mentioned that might help bring about this ever more equitable future.
Another passion I had in education was around universal design for learning. It's part of, now written into law, into the ESEA.
Every Student Succeeds Act.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There's other words for it, but that's exactly it. But it is written in, the tenets of universal design for learning are written in there. And what that means is that all students are allowed to have and will have multiple means of representation in terms of how something is presented to them for learning, multiple means of expression, ways that they can show their learning. Doesn't always have to be a written piece of paper. And then finally, multiple means of engagement, finding ways to engage all students based on their interests, based on the technology can fit in through all of those.
Most definitely.
But oftentimes with kids, if we can engage them in some way that's more authentic.
And UDL, Universal Design, is, again, good for everybody. It helps give people that access and that engagement that works best for them. Right. Because again, one size does not fit all.
Schools must begin implementing and measuring standards as outlined by the Every Student Succeed Act as of the 2017-2018 school year. And though revisions to ESSA have taken place since it was signed into law in 2015, Universal Design for Learning, UDL, has remained a part of the Act. If you appreciated the opportunity to learn about special education and its history in this format, please share this episode of Wide Ruled with a friend. You can also support Wide Ruled financially by pledging support at patreon.com/Wide Ruled Podcast. I'm Nathaniel Bozarth, and this has been Wide Ruled, Brain Roots podcast on the past and present of equality in education. Wide Ruled is produced by myself, along with executive producer Christopher Cook, music from Audio Blocks. Thanks for listening.